You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. This podcast is hosted by two women who never met in real life but did bond over murder, mystery, and the macabre throughout history. Well, we didn't bond throughout history. Well, in a way, but anyway, we became real friends, I want to say.
Yeah, it's been a few years now, so we're historic. It's fine. Yeah, it's amazing, though. Now we get together every week to talk about all of those spooky, sad, scary, and just plain horrifying stories out there and share them with you. Also history, a lot of history, and then, of course, some occasional oversharing of our private lives. Mostly me. That's my problem. That's Fresh Hell Podcast for you. So, yeah, we've made it to December. It's the last month of the year. Huzzah. A little bit of info for new Hellions. Every year, we take a little holiday break for the last week of December and the first 2 weeks of January, which means that the last episode of 2024 is going to be our Christmas episode, right?
Yes.
And that will drop on December 20th. And then we're going to take a little break and enjoy family time. And in my case, I need to just really declutter my home. And then we're going to be back in 2025. Our first episode will be on the 17th of January. So, yeah, don't panic. It's just we take a couple weeks off at the new year, and usually in the summer, we also take a couple weeks off. So, yeah, that's all. We'll be back. Don't you worry. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into today's episode because I'm excited for this. This is a terrible, terrible case that Johanna has for us from Germany.
That's right. It's a case I myself knew nothing about up until 6 weeks or so ago, I think, but I was so upset by all of it that really I need to talk about it because I told my husband about it. I told Annie a little bit about it. I talked a little bit about it in our last Patreon get-together, but I'm still thinking a lot about it. Annie, do you have these cases that you hear about and then they don't let go of you until you kind of told everyone about it and you kind of got it out?
Yeah, I mean, that's why we're here. But this one, I know exactly what you mean. This is a special one for you where it feels...
I don't know why, but it was... Yeah, I'm going to explain to you. Just a little information. If my sound is somehow different today, or if you hear Jem tippy-toeing around in the background, it's because finally I have an office with a desk and everything set on my office desk, and Jem is kind of nervous about the whole changes here. But and if the sound is a little bit off, we're going to work on it and make it better. But I think everything should be fine.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
I have to quickly explain how I stumbled across this case. There exists a German newspaper called Die Zeit. And Die Zeit is one of Germany's most prestigious weekly newspapers, and it's mostly known for its in-depth investigative journalism, long-form reporting, and thoughtful commentary on politics, culture, society. It's a really good newspaper. It was founded in 1946 in Hamburg, I think. I know they are now based in Hamburg. I'm not quite sure if they were founded there. Anyway, Die Zeit is definitely a cornerstone of German journalism with a reputation for very high quality, detailed and analytical coverage of both national and international issues. And Die Zeit has a magazine spin-off called Die Zeit Verbrechen, translate to Zeit Crimes. And you might have guessed it from the name, it focuses exclusively on crime reporting. I can highly recommend it. And of course, Die Zeit Verbrechen has now its own podcast. It's hosted by Sabine Rückert, who is a veteran journalist and the deputy editor-in-chief for Die Zeit, and Andreas Sendker, who leads Die Zeit science section. They revisit some of the most intriguing and unsettling crime stories that Sabine Rückert has covered during her career. Now I have to confess something. Until recently, I never listened to the podcast because I always want to go kind of with a clean slate into cases we cover. Mm-hmm. It's an amazing podcast which would intimidate me a lot. You know what I'm talking about, Annie, right?
I do, yep.
But Die Zeitverbrechen now also made a TV show. In November 2024, the German streaming service RTL Plus released a 4-part anthology series titled Zeitverbrechen, inspired by episodes of the podcast, and each episode dramatizes a real criminal case previously discussed on the podcast, offering kind of a fictionalized yet insightful portrayal of the events. And that show I watched. The first episode is titled December, and it's based on the crime that I want to talk about today. It was directed by Mariko Minaguchi, recounts the final hours of an 18-year-old who, after a night out, finds himself abandoned in a desolate area, leading to a very tragic outcome. And that episode hooked me, and I wanted to know more about the real-life case that it was based on. So I started reading up and I listened to the episode of Die Zeitverbrechen. It's episode 9 from 14th of August 2018, titled Bei Anruf Tod, which translates to a call to death maybe, or fatal call, or death on the line, something like that. It's hard to really find the right tone for the translation. Anyway, this is a great episode. Sabine Rückert and Andreas Senka are great. And of course, their amazing episode is a great source for this episode of ours. Other than that, I use contemporary newspaper articles, and as always, you'll find everything in our sources. Sorry for the lengthy explanation of how I got here, but I think credit was necessary. Credit where credit is due, right?
Yeah. We find inspiration in all kinds of different places. I think I once watched like a very dramatized TV, one of these television shows on, what was it? Oh, it was probably the Rebecca Zahow case, is what sparked my initial interest. Then, of course, I dove deeper into it all, but had I not watched that program, I wouldn't have known, we got to tell you where we find the stuff.
One of my favorite 2-part episodes about Marguerite Carouge. That started because I watched the movie The Last Duel by Ridley Scott. So yeah, we take inspiration in a lot of places.
All the time.
So this all takes place in Schleswig-Holstein, Germany's northernmost state. I think from an international viewpoint, Schleswig-Holstein often flies a little bit under the radar. It's overshadowed by the shabby, sexy coolness of Berlin or the traditional Catholic charm of Bavaria. But Schleswig-Holstein has its own very distinct character. It's a place of contrast. You have wide open fields, small villages, quiet roads that stretch endlessly into the distance. And yet you're never far from the sea, with both the North Sea and the Baltic Sea very close by. Now, about 50 kilometers south of the Baltic coast, you'll find Lübeck. This historic city is famous for its medieval architecture and its role in the Hanseatic League. If you ever seen photos of Germany's famous brick Gothic buildings, chances are very high these were photos taken in Lübeck. But Lübeck isn't the main focus of our story today. This isn't about the city center with its cobblestone streets and picturesque views. This is about the outskirts, where city life blurs into the countryside. Beyond Lübeck and Kiel, by the way, that's the state's capital, Schleswig-Holstein is mostly rural, dotted with tiny towns, farms, and a handful of roads that seem to go on forever. And one of these rural areas is Großweden. It's small, quiet, and very unremarkable, except for Die Ziegelei. This massive nightclub was a hotspot for young people, pulling in partygoers from nearby towns and villages. At some point, Die Ziegelei could call itself the biggest discotheque in northern Germany. Discos like this are a lifeline for the youth in places like Großweden, where nightlife options are very few and far between. Our story takes us to one of those roads, a lonely stretch near a place called Grummesser Heide. By day, judging from the photos I saw, it looks lovely: water, open land, fields, occasional farmhouses. By night, it's something else entirely. The darkness can be intense, suffocating. If you turn off your headlights, you can't even see your own hand in front of your face. For anyone who finds themselves alone here, it's like being swallowed. And this is where everything happens. This quiet, unassuming patch of Schleswig-Holstein becomes the backdrop for one of the most tragic and preventable deaths I've ever heard about. But before we get into that, let's talk about what brought someone here in the first place. Let's start with what we know about Robert Syrokowski. Robert was 18 years old, a high school senior from Lübeck, about to graduate with his whole life ahead of him. He had just moved that day with his family to a new apartment within the same city. Robert lives there with his parents and his younger sister. On the night of November 30th to December 1st, 2002, Robert and a few friends decide to go out to party at Die Ziegelei, which is the massive disco in Großweden. It's about 20 kilometers from his home. And as I said before, discos like this are a big deal in rural Europe. Places where young people gather to blow off steam, dance, and drink. And I know this is a major cultural difference between many European countries and the US. Here you can drink beer and wine at age 16 and hard alcohol at age 18. It's absolutely common that 18-year-olds go out and get absolutely wasted. And there is a whole discussion to be had about the dangers of all of that. One of the biggest problems here is drunk driving. Another one is binge drinking. But this would be too big of a topic for this episode. And it's also not the point, in my opinion.
Right. No, not at all. Not the point. I think that despite the differences, I think that the issues of young people and alcohol and drugs are always going to be kind of universal, right? With that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's wild. When we went, so I mentioned this previously, we did a host family. So we had a girl from Spain come and live with us for the summer. And we got along so well that we then went to visit her. And so my sister and I went over. I was 17. And we went to a nightclub, and it was really surprising because we basically got on a bus, and it was like, yeah, we're going to a discotheque. But I was like on the bus, and Moose and I are like, are we really going to a nightclub? This feels like the start of a horror movie. Like, it felt like we were literally in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. But we arrived at this club, and no one in my group really got too drunk. I think we each had a couple of ciders or something, but nothing crazy. It wasn't the case for everyone there, obviously. But it was so fun. There was a foam room. I danced in a cage.
And these places are huge, right? They're huge.
Huge. Like nothing I've ever experienced in the United States. I've never seen... To be fair, it's not like I'm a huge club girl. My clubbing days were like... oh, I'm going to date myself now. Daytona, Jacksonville, Boston. That's kind of the extent of my nightclub experiences. So very, very limited, but nothing like that exists around here. It felt very, very sexy and exotic to my 17 or 18-year-old self. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
And in the US, clubs like this are all 21 plus. Yeah.
I assume that Robert and his friends did what many teenagers do especially when money is tight. They pre-drank. In German, we call that Vorglühen, which means preheating. The term actually originates from car technology. You know how in cold weather you have to be very careful to preheat the glow plugs in a diesel engine before starting the vehicle. That's Vorglühen. And just like the diesel engine needs to preheat before running, people preheat with the drinks to get into the right mood for the night ahead.
I like preheat better than what we say. Here we say pregame. So like drink up before you get in because the prices in the park or the stadium are going to be absolute extortion. So we better pregame. So that's what we say, even if you're not going to a game. I like preheated better. I think I'm going to start using preheated when nothing involves a game and see if I can get that to take off. I suggest everyone listening does the same.
Yeah.
Let's just preheat ourselves.
So Robert and his friends arrive at the Ziegelei, they pay their entry, and they join the very lively, crowded scene. By all accounts, it was a very fun and very typical night until around 2:30 a.m. That's when Robert told his friends he was heading to the restroom. He never came back. And no one thought much of it. In a place as big and as chaotic and loud as the Ziegelei, it's very easy to lose track of someone. Initially, Robert had indeed gone to the restroom, but shortly after exited the building and stepped into the cold December night. He was wearing only sneakers, socks, jeans, and a very thin black cotton sweater, so not nearly enough for the near-freezing temperatures. But I doubt he thought he would be outside for more than just a couple of minutes, so why take his jacket from the coat check? I assume he needed some fresh air, he might have felt nauseated, the alcohol, the cigarette smoke. He walked a couple of steps down the road alone and eventually collapsed, unable to continue. And this was the beginning of a series of events that would tragically end Robert's life. And while much of that night remains unclear, what we do know paints a very chilling picture of negligence, missed opportunities, and systemic failure. Shortly after Robert left die Ziegelei, a police patrol car on a routine circuit around the disco spotted someone lying next to the road. Of course, that was Robert. And at first glance, he appeared to be unconscious, and the officers categorized him as what they call a Hilope, which is short for hilflose Person, so a helpless person. Now, in situations like this, the standard protocol is, of course, to ensure the individual's safety. So the officers called the ambulance, which arrived quickly. The paramedics wrapped Robert in a thermal blanket, a standard measure to prevent further hypothermia. And let's not forget, it was December 1st, and the temperature was hovering around 4 degrees Celsius, and it dropped even lower later on. And as I said, he was wearing just this thin sweater, jeans, sneakers, so completely unprepared for the cold.
Yeah, around 4 degrees would be like upper 30s, so above freezing, but only just above freezing.
Just slightly above freezing.
Yeah, and he's dressed for the club.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about jeans and a sweater, but we're talking thin.
Yeah.
Imagine what you would wear out to a nightclub where you're dancing. And
he was not wearing like a thick sweater or hoodie, like a thin cotton sweater, the kind.
Exactly. Yeah.
At some point, Robert regained consciousness and the paramedics and police started to question him, and Robert admitted he'd been drinking earlier. And he also claimed he'd taken drugs. Now, we know now that wasn't true. No drugs were found in his system later. And my best guess is that Robert said it because he was disoriented, or maybe he thought someone had put something in his drink. I don't know. Either way, no drugs in his system at all. At some point, Robert was alert enough to answer the questions and insisted he didn't want to go to the hospital. And here is where things started to go horribly wrong. The paramedics and the police left. They left an 18-year-old, visibly intoxicated, confused, and probably already a little bit hypothermic teenager alone, basically in the middle, not yet in the middle of nowhere, but they left him alone in the street. Robert was legally an adult, but was he in any state to make a rational decision? His body was still reeling from the effects of the alcohol. He might have appeared coherent to them, but medically he was far from okay, I think. And yet, both the paramedics and the police decided he wasn't their problem anymore at all. They assumed that if Robert didn't want help, he didn't need help.
That just makes me feel sick, especially because they didn't know there were no drugs in his system.
Exactly.
And he admitted to taking drugs.
Yeah, they didn't.
They didn't know anything about what was going on with him.
They found him unconscious in the street, so...
Yeah. It's very upsetting.
He was abandoned. He wasn't taken to the hospital. He wasn't taken home. He wasn't even taken to the police station to sober up and, call his parents. He was simply left outside in the cold December night. There was no coordination between the paramedics and the police about who was actually responsible for Robert at that moment. Later, during the investigation, both sides pointed fingers at each other. The paramedics said, well, we thought the police were staying with him. And the police said, well, we assumed the paramedics were taking him to the hospital. And in the end, no one took responsibility. To be fair, I have to say one thing. From what I understand, this all took place really just a couple of steps from the entrance of the discotheque. So the assumption might have been that he would go back in to get back with his friends. But he didn't do that. Maybe he even tried to get back in, but was denied access because he was too drunk. This is just my guess now, because I know this happens very often.
Yeah. I can imagine.
We know that Robert had been walking away from the Ziegelei at some point. He stumbled upon a house, and this was the home of the family B. Just B, the letter. We don't have the full name. You know how it is with these European cases. A couple and their 5 children who were asleep inside. So Robert stumbles upon this house and he rings their doorbell. I think the family was used to some nightly shenanigans during weekends because they were living so close to this huge discotheque. If you live in such a place, you definitely experience a lot of, crazy teenager stuff, crazy drunk teenager stuff. So Robert rings the doorbell and I'm sure the couple just rolled their eyes and were like, oh, we got another one. And then Mr. B opened the door. He was met by this young man who, despite his disheveled appearance, was incredibly polite. Like really, really polite. And Robert said something like, I bought this house an hour ago and I'd like to go to bed, please, so just leave. And the family tried to reason with him. They told him, this isn't your house, we live here. And Robert apologized and he walked away, disappearing into the night. And I'm sure the family was like relieved and thought, well, that was easy enough, and wanted to go back to bed. But no, because moments later, Robert returned. This time he was wandering around the property, clutching his phone to his ear. From the family's perspective, it looked like he was having a conversation, but now we know that his phone was basically dead. There was no call, no one on the other end. Robert was talking to himself, mumbling incoherently, and then he went around the back, tried to enter through the back door. By now, the family was understandably annoyed, and I'm sure they really tried hard to not wake their kids. Mr. B described Robert as behaving like a robot, moving mechanically, and his gaze was very distant and unfocused. But he wasn't violent or aggressive or anything like this. I'm sure, though, that his presence was definitely a bit unnerving, especially with the children in the house. Because, you just want to go back to bed. You don't want to deal with drunk teenagers on a Saturday night.
Of course.
So at this point, Mrs. B calls the police. She explains that there's a strange young man wandering around the property and he's acting erratically and he's trying to get inside. And while waiting for the police, the family kept an eye on Robert from the windows, and they saw him pacing back and forth, occasionally pressing his phone to his ear, still talking to absolutely no one. And for them, it was clear something was very wrong with this young man. And when the police finally arrived, it was a different set of officers from those who had encountered Robert earlier that night. These officers, let's call them G and M, knew about the encounter their colleagues had had a short while before. So they were aware that an ambulance had been called before and that there had been a problem already. They approached Robert cautiously and he stumbled towards them, still holding the dead phone, and he mumbled something very incomprehensible. So the officers checked Robert's ID. That's also how Family B learns Robert's last name. And the police sees that he lives in Lübeck, even though the address in the ID is not correct. He just moved it there, but that's not important. One of the officers asks, "What are you doing here?" And Robert replies, "I live here." And the officer responds, "No, you don't. Who are we?" And Robert paused and looks at them and says, "You're police officers." And here's where the situation starts to take somewhat of a very disturbing turn, in my opinion, because instead of treating him as someone in obvious distress or someone who's having problems because he's maybe just drunk, but still, he's a young man who's in some kind of distress. And they don't help him, they start mocking him. The officer replies, "No, I'm the president of the United States and this is Mickey Mouse," pointing at his colleague.
This is bad. I can hear this is
not good. I hate everything. Like, really, this case.
Yeah, I can hear my cop family and friends like, this would make them very angry.
Exactly, that's the thing. I know so many police men and women, and there are awesome people, and then you have this kind of horrible people, and they... horrible. Makes me so upset.
Yeah.
The B family later described the officers' behavior as shockingly unprofessional. They were expecting help, but they saw that the two officers were just making jokes at the expense of someone who was clearly very vulnerable at that moment. Despite his confusion, Robert complied with the officers. They told him to leave the property, and once again he was left alone in the cold, dark night, aimlessly wandering with nowhere to go. This moment, like so many others that night, could have been a turning point. The police officers could have taken Robert into protective custody, again driven him to the hospital, or at the very least ensured he was safe, but they didn't.
Yeah. It's also very upsetting that nobody is taking this seriously as a hypothermia issue.
Yeah.
Everyone's just like, drunk kid, and yeah.
Especially as the police officers knew that an ambulance had been already involved.
Right.
So, after being sent away by the police, Robert wanders into the darkness once again, and a short while later the police officers return because they want to see if Robert had actually followed their order to leave the family's property. And they find him a couple of steps away at the entrance of a recycling facility. And remember, this is all happening in a relatively small area. The discotheque, the house of the family, and this recycling unit, they are very close to each other. It's dark, and Robert is still very intoxicated, and he trips and falls over a barrier chain, which was about like half a meter off the ground, so like at knee height, probably. obviously because it's dark, I think there were reflectors on it, but he's not in the best state of mind. He didn't see it, and he stumbles into the chain, and he trips and falls, and he's hitting, the pavement with full force. He fell really hard to the ground. And the police officers see this, and this time they decide to take him into custody. Not to help him, but to remove him from the area. They place Robert into the back of the patrol car and they drive away. And we wouldn't know any of this if it weren't for the family B, who stood at their window watching Robert getting into the police car and the car driving off. And I'm sure they were relieved that this young man was now in the safe hands of the police. Because that's what you want, right? If your teenager is out there drunk, you'd hope for the police or the ambulance to take them into their custody. Because, okay, maybe they're in trouble, but at least they are safe, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what you'd hope.
But honestly, what happened next is almost incomprehensible, in my opinion. And we don't even know what exactly went down because the only people who know what really happened next were not exactly helpful with coming forward. Around 5:30 a.m., a young woman was driving through the Krumesser Heide, which is this quiet, desolate area about 10 kilometers or roughly 6 miles from the Ziegelei. The road, the Krunsforder Hauptstraße she was traveling on, was unlit, like most rural roads in Schleswig-Holstein, and surrounded by open fields and trees. And in the darkness, the landscape seemed empty and lifeless, until it wasn't, because suddenly her car hit something. Hard. At first, she didn't know what it was, like an animal, a fallen branch, or perhaps some debris left on the road. But whatever it was, it must have been something rather large, and she pulled over immediately. Not long after, another car came down the road, and the driver noticed the stopped vehicle and decided to check if there was anything he could do, if she needed help. She was crying, she was really upset, and she said, "I don't know what it was, I hit something. I didn't see anything, but I hit something." And so the second driver takes a flashlight and he begins searching for what had caused the collision. And that's when he finds him. Robert was lying motionless in the road about 20 meters or 65 feet away from where the collision had occurred. The force of the impact had thrown his body that far. His feet were bare, his shoes and socks were missing entirely. They were later found a bit further down the road, I think. And he was dressed, as I said, only in the thin black sweater and the jeans. And the young woman obviously was horrified. The thing she had hit, the thing that had been sitting in the middle of the street, had not been a branch or an animal. It had been Robert Syrokowski, and she hadn't seen him sitting there in the middle of the road until it was far too late. He had been completely motionless, offering no indication of his presence. Also, remember, his sweater was black.
I was just going to say, he was dressed in all dark clothes. Oh, that poor woman. That's devastating.
There was nothing she could have done. The driver hadn't been drinking. She didn't drive too fast. All of these things would later be determined. So, okay, an ambulance is called, and when the first responders arrived, they confirmed that the impact had killed Robert instantly. But as they examined the scene, more questions began to surface, like why was this young man sitting barefoot in the middle of a dark road in the freezing cold, miles from safety? His body bore the unmistakable signs of hypothermia, and the lack of shoes and socks suggested that he had been in an advanced state of confusion before the collision.
Yeah, we talked about this when we did the Dyatlov episode. The thing about hypothermia is, as the body gets colder, something called paradoxical undressing can sometimes happen. It's one of the really cruelest tricks the human body can play on itself. Basically, what happens is when you're freezing, your body normally works really hard to keep those vital organs warm. And it does this by narrowing blood vessels near your skin in order to preserve heat deeper down in the core. But in the later stages of hypothermia, when your body is losing the fight, something bizarre happens. The blood vessels suddenly expand, which sends warm blood rushing to the surface of your skin. And this creates this overwhelming sensation of heat, like you're burning up, even though your core temperature is dangerously low. And because your brain is already impaired from the cold, you react instinctively and start taking clothes off, hoping to cool down. People who experience this phenomena are usually, unfortunately, in the final stages of hypothermia. And this is why so many victims are found partially undressed, even in freezing conditions.
Exactly, yeah. And in Robert's case, it's likely why he ended up barefoot, without the shoes or the socks, in the middle of the freezing December night. And we probably wouldn't know what had happened to Robert if it weren't for the family B. So the very next day, as they were going about their morning routine, the B family heard a news report on the radio, and it mentioned that a young man had been struck by a car and killed nearby in the early hours of the morning. And Mrs. B turns to her husband and she says, "Do you think it could have been that young man who was at our house last night?" And at first her husband dismisses the idea. He's like, "Why would you think it would be him? I mean, it doesn't make sense. It would be such a huge coincidence. The police took him and it doesn't make any sense, right?" But for her, the thought lingered, and a few days later, Mrs. B reads an obituary in the newspaper. And it was for the 18-year-old who had been killed in the street nearby by the name Robert Syrokowski from Lübeck. Something just clicked, and she remembered seeing Robert's ID, and she recognizes the name immediately. It's not a very common name. It's not like Müller or Meyer. Still, she wanted to be absolutely certain, and so Mrs. B finds the Syrokowski family listed in the Lübeck phone directory, and she calls the number and she speaks with Robert's grandmother. And that's when her suspicions were confirmed. The young man who had died was the same person who had wandered to their house in the middle of the night. And now Mrs. B tells Robert's family everything she knew about his state that night, how he'd seemed lost, confused, vulnerable, and how the police had come to remove him. She described how they had seen the officers mocking him before sending him away, and how the family had watched him from their windows as Robert was driven off in the patrol car. And for Robert's parents, this information was devastating, but it was also the beginning of their fight for answers. If it hadn't been for the B family's persistence, much of what had happened to Robert that night might have remained an absolute mystery. And of course, the first thing they did was contacting the police, demanding answers of what had happened the night their teenage son died. Because, hey, you took him in, he was in a patrol car, how did he end up in the middle of a road in nowhere? So basically, the officers claimed that they had picked Robert up and drove him towards Lübeck to take him home. And at some point, he demanded to be let out of the car, so around 4:15 a.m., they stopped near a bridge in a very desolate area, far from any homes or businesses. And they told him he could call a taxi to get home and left him there because they saw he had a phone. But his phone was not working properly. He couldn't make a call despite his repeated attempts to dial emergency numbers. And we know that because of the phone records, Robert tried desperately to call for help before his death. The records revealed that he dialed Germany's emergency number 110 multiple times, but because his phone wasn't functioning properly, none of the calls connected. I think he also tried to call his parents and his girlfriend.
This is so devastating. This is so sad. So the police are saying they did nothing wrong then. They're just like, well, we tried to take him home, but he wanted to get out, and so we let him go. Like, that was it?
Yeah, and they said that by the time he appeared to be sober again, so they thought he would be fine. You know, this boy with this thin sweater in the middle of nowhere in December.
In the dark. Yeah, this is not... And was he really sober and capable of making informed decisions? I mean, there's no way.
Doubtful. Just a short while ago, he was completely confused, tried to get into the house of strangers, and the autopsy revealed that his blood alcohol concentration was 1.3 per mil. I think in the US you say 0.13%, right? This level of intoxication is significant. It's a kind of level where your balance is off, your coordination is off, your judgment is clearly impaired. You might stumble when walking or have trouble focusing, but it's also not so extreme that you would be completely incapacitated. But you shouldn't forget a couple of hours had already passed between when he first left the discotheque around 2:30 to 4:15, right? When he was left by the police. But still. He was not sober. However, the alcohol wasn't the only factor affecting Robert that night. The hypothermia combined with the intoxication is a very dangerous mix. The cold slows down your body's functions, while the alcohol, which dilates your blood vessels, makes you lose heat even faster, and together they amplify confusion, disorientation, and poor decision making. And this is what gets me even more. It's one thing if you leave this boy in the middle of nowhere in summer, which would be still absolutely dangerous and irresponsible, don't get me wrong. But in the freezing cold winter night, a teenager in a sweater and jeans, even if he were completely sober, which he clearly wasn't, how can any person, any grown-up, think this is a normal thing to do? And the police officers were in their 40s and 50s. These were experienced people. And it makes me so angry and so sad.
Yeah, this entire thing is hugely problematic and upsetting. I feel awful for both of the families. I feel awful for Robert's family, and I feel awful for that woman and her, loved ones, because that kind of thing affects you your entire life.
But also the family with the house.
Yes.
They thought, okay, he's in the hand of the police, they're gonna take care of him, but still, I'm sure they had like this kind of survivor guilt where we should have done something differently.
Of course. It's awful.
So, Robert's parents knew something wasn't right, and the police had claimed they had no responsibility for what happened to Robert that night, but the B family's testimony told a very different story. Determined to uncover the truth, the Syrokowski family hired a lawyer. His name was Klaus Nentwig. He was a notary from Lübeck. He wasn't a criminal defense lawyer by trade, but he believed in Robert's case, and he was willing to take on this monumental task to piece together what happened that night and hold those responsible accountable. However, almost immediately, they ran into roadblocks. The local district attorney seemed super uninterested in pursuing the case. Requests for evidence were delayed or ignored, critical documents went missing, and any attempts to question the actions of the police were met with absolute resistance. This wasn't just bad luck, all in all. It seemed like active negligence or actively blocking any investigation in that direction. And this pattern of delay and indifference continued at every turn. Nentwig's frustration grew, but he didn't give up. He filed complaints with higher authorities and eventually taking the case to the Schleswig-Holstein Attorney General. And after years of persistence, the family's efforts paid off. The Attorney General ordered a full investigation into the actions or inactions of the police officers involved. And finally, in 2007, so nearly 5 years after Robert's death, the case went to trial at the Lübeck Regional Court. 2 officers, G and M, were charged with negligent homicide. The charges were based on the decision to abandon Robert in a very vulnerable state, miles from safety, knowing he couldn't call for help or protect himself. The trial was, of course, emotionally charged. The Syrokowski family sat through every hearing, listening to the officers insist they had done nothing wrong. They claimed Robert had been coherent and capable of taking care of himself when they dropped him off. But their story didn't hold up under scrutiny. Witnesses, including the B family, painted a very different picture, and they described Robert as confused, disoriented, and in no condition to make rational decisions. The court also heard how the officers failed to follow their basic protocols like documenting their actions or ensuring Robert's safety before leaving him alone. Both officers were convicted of negligent manslaughter and sentenced to 9 months of probation. Under German law, this meant they could remain in the police force. Probation sentences under a year do not automatically result in dismissal, and the officers could have continued their careers. But what did they do? Instead of accepting the verdict, G&M appealed, hoping to clear their names entirely. They didn't want to take the 9 months on probation. It was a gamble and one that would cost them dearly. And I say good, really good.
Mm-hmm.
The Federal Court of Justice reviewed the case and upheld the convictions. They didn't believe that they ever had the intention of taking Robert home because they had never called in to inform the station of what they were doing. The judge found this behavior extremely suspicious. He's like, if you don't have anything to hide, why didn't you inform the station where you were driving? Which is true.
Yeah.
As suspicious as the fact that they didn't drop him in the more populated area that they had passed through. Instead, they dropped him off in the middle of nowhere. In fact, the court decided that the original sentence had been too lenient and sent the case back to lower court for stricter sentencing. And this time, one officer received a prison sentence of over a year, which automatically disqualified him from serving as a police officer any longer, and the other narrowly avoided dismissal but faced significant professional consequences. I think his sentence still stayed at 9 months on probation.
Wow.
I think it was even after the second verdict that one of the officers said he doesn't think they did anything wrong and that he would do the same again if in the same situation. I'm paraphrasing here, but I remember reading that.
Wow. That's pretty ironic, isn't it? That by appealing, they not only drew more scrutiny to what they had done, but also guaranteed worse penalties, harsher penalties. If they had just taken the accountability and accepted the original 9-month probation sentence, they could have just stayed in the police force. And instead, the refusal to take any kind of accountability, responsibility, ultimately ended their careers, as it should. I keep thinking of the young woman who hit Robert with her car, that she must have been absolutely devastated. Do we know what happened to her?
The accident wasn't her fault. Robert had been sitting motionless in the middle of the dark, unlit road. As I said, she wasn't driving too fast, she wasn't drunk, she had her lights on. It just was a horrible accident. But she struggled to cope with the guilt, and witnesses described her as devastated, unable to process what had happened, and in a very heartbreaking twist, the woman herself died in a car accident not long before the Lübeck trial began. Her father later wrote to the court explaining how deeply the incident had affected her. Like, she had trouble sleeping, and it was horrible. Her life was destroyed.
Of course it was. So many lives destroyed by what the police did or didn't do. But, I mean, what do you think? Why do you think the police left him in the middle of nowhere? Were they just being cruel?
The big questions in this case, right? And the officers themselves never provided a satisfying answer, but based on their actions and based on similar incidents, we can speculate a little bit. So, to me, the most likely reason, I think they simply didn't want to deal with him. To them, Robert was probably just a nuisance, an intoxicated young man causing trouble. They've been through the same thing so many weekends, and they were just like, yeah, we're done with that.
They're over it.
By dropping him far from the nightclub and their jurisdiction, they might have hoped the problem would solve itself. Maybe he'd find his way home, or maybe someone else, or, they dropped him, I think they dropped him just right where their jurisdiction had stopped. Just right across the border, basically. And I was talking to my husband about it, and he's like, well, we don't know how many times they might have done something similar before and nothing ever happened. And we just don't know.
Totally.
Another possibility is that they underestimated how vulnerable Robert really was. They might have seen this drunk young man and assumed he could manage on his own. But hypothermia combined with the intoxication is so dangerous. And if the officers had taken the time to really assess his condition properly, they would have realized he wasn't capable of getting himself to safety. And then there's also the unpleasant reality of bureaucracy. Taking Robert to a hospital or back to the station would have meant paperwork, procedures, and time. And I can also see them they just didn't want to bother. Dropping him off in the middle of nowhere was just faster and easier for them. And yeah, they probably thought no one would ever know, because if nothing happens, nobody would ever know.
Yeah.
But yeah, this wasn't just poor judgment. It was a complete disregard for their duty of care. These officers were supposed to protect vulnerable individuals and not abandon them. Early in the night, they'd mocked Robert, jokingly calling themselves the President of the United States and Mickey Mouse, and it's clear they didn't take him seriously. And they were viewing him as a problem to get rid of, rather than a person in need of help. And I keep wondering, I'm sure they probably had kids themselves. How can you be like that?
You would hope. Yeah. I think sometimes you get that mentality also of well, I survived this stuff when I was a kid, so they're just going to go through it and have a story to tell. I think that could also very much be at play. Not to excuse anything that they've done, but I could see where that sort of mentality...
Yeah. This kind of negligence, unfortunately, isn't unheard of. In other cases, there have been reports of police officers abandoning intoxicated or vulnerable people in remote areas to avoid dealing with the situation. It's rare. I don't want to say it happens all the time. It's rare, but it happens. And it's always devastating if something happens. I know of one case where there was a homeless person who was just abandoned in the middle of winter. He was drunk and he died, and it's horrible.
It's awful. It's awful. This case is so sad. It reminds me a lot, in many ways, of the Maitrice Richardson case, which is on my list. I wonder if the fact that he was a boy influenced things. Had he been a young woman, would they have felt more protective of her and made sure she got home? You know what I mean? Or could it have been worse, more exploitive? Would it have been an even more tragic story? This is incredibly sad. I know why this was keeping you up at night. This is a bad one. Thank you.
it would have been so easily avoidable.
Yes, very easily preventable.
Do you have something good?
Something good. Do you have anything good?
Yes, my something good is that I finally have a place to properly work. I have an office, and I'm so glad and thrilled. It's still like not my permanent office because we're still renovating the upstairs part, but for now it's my office and it's great. Everything is on my desk. I didn't have to carry around my microphone and set everything up. I was just, everything is set. It's lovely. That's my something good.
Amazing. That is a very something good for sure. Yeah, I had a great time hosting family who came for Thanksgiving, so that was really nice, and I've still got lots of company, which I love. I have a friend staying for a little while, and my sister's got the week off, so she's visiting. So I'm super excited about that. I also have just a reminder for everyone to please, please, please don't stop your car on railroad tracks. We just had an accident locally that was just all over the news right before I came in to record, where a driver was in like gridlock traffic and just stopped on the tracks. So when the gates came down, they couldn't move, basically. They couldn't go forward or backward because of the gates, and then the train hit them. I think the driver is going to be okay, but it's just a reminder that, we're all so busy this time of year. But just remember, please, please, if you cannot make it to the other side of railroad tracks, I do this even on ones that I'm like certain there's no trains on anymore. If there are railroad tracks, don't stop on them. Wait until you can completely clear the tracks and then go. If you can't make it all the way through the intersection, the stoplight, wait until you can. You know what I mean? Sometimes that means you got to clear that gridlock a little bit and miss a light, And maybe someone behind you is honking, but just let them honk because your life is worth more than the impatience of the asshole behind you. You know what I mean? Like, wait till you can clear an intersection. Don't become the gridlock you want to get rid of in the world. And never park on railroad tracks. Never stop your car on railroad tracks. Just wait till you can all the way past them. Please, 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 everybody be safe this holiday season. That's my rant. Sorry. I'm just like, Urgh. If you enjoyed this episode, which I did very much, Johanna, I thought this was terrible and fascinating, please leave us a review or a rating. Both. We really appreciate it. You can leave comments on Spotify. You could like our Facebook page, which is different from our Facebook group. We have a Facebook page, which we would love it if you would like. That's pretty much just very standard updates about what we're working on, what we've just released, that kind of thing. Our Facebook group is just about 4,000 of the most lovely, delightful weirdos on the internet, and that is a lovely place. So come say hello. We talk about all kinds, everything but politics, really, in the Facebook group. So come say hi. If you would like to get in touch with us or find out more about us or get some information on our Patreon info, our website is freshhellpodcast.com. Our email is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to send us your terrible dating stories and also any other hey, let me tell you about this weird thing that happened to me story. We love those. What else, Johanna? Is that it? Did I cover everything?
I think that's it. Please tell your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, treat them kindly. If you're in the northern hemisphere and you're experiencing winter like Annie and I do, please make sure they're always warm under your blankets. If you're cold, they're cold. And be kind to them. And be kind to your fellow human being. If they're in need, if they are vulnerable, if they need help, try to help. And the most important part, but also very hard, is be kind to yourself.
That's right. And if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.